So I want to talk today about some of the Christological themes in the Harry Potter series. A lot of this is going to revolve around Harry himself, who is, I'll argue, a Christ figure in the books. But some of it is just themes within the book itself, not particularly or directly related to Harry over other characters. Okay, so let's talk about what happens to Harry right after his family is attacked by Voldemort. What happens is, of course, he survives the attack. Voldemort is defeated, at least temporarily. He's not killed. We don't know that yet, at least at this stage. But what happens is Harry has to go live with his aunt and uncle for the next, 11 years, but really like 17 years, off and on at least. So why is that happening? Well, because Dumbledore fears for Harry's safety. And why is that? Well, now Harry is some sort of like ascendant figure. I mean, you could even say quasi-politically. Dumbledore is afraid that Voldemort or Voldemort's supporters will fear the rising influence and importance and abilities of Harry Potter, and that they'll attack him, kill him. So what's really happening is Harry is going into exile then. So this is our first parallel with the story of Jesus, because of course Jesus himself, when he is born, shortly after being born, has to go into exile in Egypt. This is mentioned in one of the Gospels, because people are out to kill him because of his ascendancy. So Harry, just like Jesus, goes into exile because people are trying to kill or might be trying to kill him because of his rising influence and importance in the world. All right, now let's talk about Harry's death. Now, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but it's not one I feel bad about because you've had a few decades on this. And this is where a lot of the parallels come in. The most obvious one is that Harry dies and is resurrected, just like Jesus. Harry has to die, in fact. This is part of the prophecy. He has to die because Voldemort's soul, we don't know this until the last book, is grafted into Harry. That is, Harry has become accidentally a Horcrux. Part of Voldemort's split soul is in him, so he has to die so that part of Voldemort's soul will die. Okay, so Harry dies and is resurrected. He comes back to life. Now let's talk about the purpose of Harry's death and resurrection. Well, Harry dies to save humanity, not only the wizarding world, but also the non-wizarding world. Again, this is a parallel with the Christ story. Harry's death is what accomplishes, or is a key piece in accomplishing the victory over Voldemort. Of course, Jesus' death does the same thing. Now, in Jesus' case, there's a slight dissimilarity because it is the whole victory. By dying and possibly being resurrected, different theories of atonement have different roles for the resurrection, but the death and the resurrection, at least together, are humanity's salvation. In Harry Potter, it's a key piece. Of course, he has to go defeat Voldemort later. Okay, so the death and the resurrection save humanity. Okay, but now let's think about the way that humanity is saved. In both cases, it's by an act of weakness, by an act of humility and submission, and in fact, you could argue by an act of public shame. This is what the cross, the crucifixion is. The cross is a symbol of shame. We've kind of lost that. People wear the cross around their necks now. It's a symbol of Christian victory, I guess. But what it was originally was a symbol of shame because someone is being publicly shamed. They're dying in front of people, being tortured slowly to death. Similarly, Harry submits himself, offers himself up as a sacrifice, offers himself up in weakness, is publicly shamed by the Death Eaters as he's killed. So there's the death is not only salvific of humanity, but it's willingly offered and an act of public humiliation and shame. Okay. Now, in both cases, you can argue, you have someone, the Christ figure, descending to the dead. There's the Apostles' Creed, which is an old creed in the Christian church, goes back probably to the 4th century, says not only did Jesus die and was resurrected, but after he died, before he was resurrected, he descended to the dead. What he was doing there, theologians have argued that it's not stated in the Apostles' Creed what he was doing there, but many, according to one tradition, he was releasing those who had been faithful but could not enter God's presence because Jesus had not died yet. So he's releasing captives. But at any rate, what happened was he descends to the dead. The people who have already died, he's there with them. Well, think about what happens to Harry after he dies. He is in some place. It's not clear whether it's in his head or not. Dumbledore kind of refuses to answer that. But he's there with Dumbledore, who is dead. And they eventually realize that Voldemort, or Harry eventually realizes that Voldemort is there too. He's underneath the bench. It's this state in which the reality of things is revealed, because it turns out that Voldemort is in this small physical state, this like broken and weak state, verging upon death. And what's happening is that in that state, the true reality has been revealed. This is what Voldemort was really like, even before death. But at any rate, Harry is there interacting with two people who are amongst the dead, and Harry himself is amongst the dead. So Harry is, in some sense, descending to the dead. Second, let's think about where Harry is when that happens. He is at, guess what? King's Cross Station. King's Cross Station is a real place. It is a reference, of course, to Jesus, who is the king, and his cross. So it's not only are these similarities there, but it's very clear at this point that Rowling is making the similarity, drawing the parallels intentionally. Of course, she said this after the fact, that she was informed by Christian themes. So we're not like stating anything really novel or new here, but it's really interesting to point these things out and kind of see some of the more subtle ones. Okay, now here's the last one on Harry's death. Let's go to the biblical source first. Let's go to the book of Genesis, chapter 3. What's happening in chapter 3 of Genesis is that humans have sinned. They've eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God confronts them about this, and then there are consequences. God pronounces curses upon Adam, upon Eve, and then upon the serpent who deceived them into sinning. And what he says to the serpent is he pronounces a couple of curses on him, and then he says this is in verse 15, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Who is the he in that claim? Well, it's referring to the offspring of the woman. But this has been interpreted by not only Christian interpreters, but also Jewish scholars, as being a messianic prophecy, a prophecy about the coming Messiah. And what it is it's claiming that some man will come who is a descendant of Eve, therefore, a human, who will crush the serpent, who represents Satan, who represents evil. So, crush the serpent, but crucially, in doing so, be wounded. And it's actually by being wounded that the crushing of the serpent happens. You will strike his heel. The serpent will strike the man's heel, but he will crush your head in so doing. It's a prophecy about the Messiah. Christians think this is Jesus. And they think, of course, that Jesus was wounded in his salvation of humanity. In fact, mortally wounded. And actually, the mortal wound was crucial to his saving of humanity. Let's think about what happens after Harry is resurrected, so to speak. after he comes back to life. What else has to happen for Voldemort to be defeated? Guess what? A serpent has to be killed. That's Nagini, Voldemort's snake, who is, I believe at that point, the last Horcrux. And at that point, Voldemort can be killed once the snake has been killed. Now, you might say to me, well, it wasn't Harry who killed that serpent, so it's kind of off. You know, we're sort of out of rhythm here in terms of Christological parallel. Well, that's true, but first point is, I'm not claiming that there's a one-for-one correlation here, but that there's a clear reference, I believe, to the killing of the serpent, which is the defeat of evil. But also, what we should realize is this. Who is it that does kill the serpent? It's Neville Longbottom. And if you go back and you remember the plot leading up to this, there's a prophecy about the defeat of Voldemort. And it's the prophecy happens before Harry's family is killed, and an attempt is made on his life. It's what prompts Voldemort to go out and kill Harry, because he hears the last part of the prophecy. And there were criteria for who the boy was that was going to defeat Voldemort. It was going to be someone born at the end of June. It was going to be someone whose parents had escaped Voldemort 3 times. And it turns out that there were 2 people who fulfilled the criteria of the prophecy. It was Harry Potter and it was Neville Longbottom. And Voldemort picked the Potters to go to because he thought that that's who it was of the 2 that fulfilled the criteria. But what this means is that there's a sense in which Neville killing the serpent, I don't want to say is the same as Harry killing the serpent, but it's a reference to the Christ figure killing the serpent, because Neville easily could have been the Christ figure in this case. It was a matter of chance who, in some sense, maybe, I guess that's maybe controversial, who ended up being the person referenced in the prophecy. In fact, Dumbledore has this sort of like reductive, cynical interpretation of the prophecy. He thinks, it's the fact that it's you it didn't have to be you. At any rate, so Neville has a connection to Harry. Neville killing the serpent is, in a sense, a reference to the Messiah figure killing the serpent. That's a little bit of a stretch, I'll grant you that. But this brings us to our next point, and this is the last point about the parallel between Jesus' death and Harry's death, which is Paul in 1 Corinthians has this spot at which he's making this really interesting parallel between Jesus and Adam. What he says, this is in the 15th chapter, he says, "For as by a man came death, by a man also has come the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive." So what he's saying here is that because sin came into the world through Adam, he talks about this in other places, because sin came into the world through Adam, it had to be a man that came to save, it had to be a human who came to save humanity from sin. This is a core feature of a lot of people's theories of the atonement, why Jesus had to be both God and man. So there's this, in order for Jesus to save humanity, there had to be a connection between him and the person who brought sin into the world, who got humanity into the problem that they are in, or were in. And that connection is humanity. Jesus had to share the humanity that Adam shared in order for Jesus to solve the problem that Adam caused. There's the same sort of thing is happening with Harry and Voldemort. Harry is the only one that can defeat Voldemort, the person who is the source in bringing evil into the world. He's the only one who could do it because he has this connection with Voldemort. The connection is not humanity in this case. It is having the same soul as Voldemort, or at least a piece of Voldemort's soul, because remember, Harry is accidentally the last Horcrux, which is why he has to die. And it's the reason why only he can be the solution to the problem, because he has that connection with Voldemort. As by Voldemort came into the world, so by the soul of Voldemort, evil has to leave the world. Okay, so that, I'd be really interested from hearing from y'all in the comments here, other parallels you see between Harry and Jesus, so sort of Christological references in Harry's character. That's what I've seen. There's two things I want to talk about as just themes in the series of Harry Potter that aren't as centrally focused on Harry as a character as those things are. So one is the sort of ethic that is displayed in the Harry Potter series. The sort of, it's not going to be as explicit as it is, say, in the Gospels, because the Gospels are not purely narrative. You have Jesus teaching in the Gospels. He's actually telling you what he's trying to show. He's not just acting, and we don't just get a pure narrative of people doing things. So it's going to be a little bit more explicit. But what you see there in the Gospels, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, is what Nietzsche would call an inversion of values. What Jesus is doing is saying all these things that society thinks are lack value are actually really valuable. In fact, the people at the bottom are going to, I put them on the top, Jesus says. For example, blessed are the meek, blessed are the oppressed, blessed are the suffering. These are all states that intuitively, and at that time for sure, would have been seen as not enviable. In fact, things you want to avoid. And Jesus is over here saying that these are blessed states. Now, in what sense that's true, I don't know, but well, I have my theories, but we don't need to go down that rabbit trail. The point is, Jesus is inverting those values. He's taking the people who have been put at the bottom, and he's elevating them. He's saying these people are at least just as important as other people. It sounds normal to us. That was a radical thing at the time. Think about the story of the Good Samaritan. Think about the injunction in the Sermon on the Mount to love your enemies. Jesus is over and over again saying, oh, these people that you've learned that you're supposed to hate or pity or look down on, you actually shouldn't. We get a similar ethic displayed in the narrative of Harry Potter. This is not just Harry. This is, all the good guys in Harry Potter are, there goes my wiener dog. All the good guys in Harry Potter are working against a contingent of people, usually represented in the Death Eaters, but I guess, other people, Death Eater adjacent, like Umbridge, who are look down on, denigrate certain classes of, certainly non-wizards, elves, any non-wizard magical folk, or any non-wizard non-magical folk, non-magical humans, muggles, elves, centaurs, giants, I'm sure there's others I'm missing. These are statuses below human, even though they're clearly what philosophers would call moral agents. They are intelligent, they have the ability to differentiate right from wrong, good from bad, they have the ability to love and communicate and all these things. Think about house elves, think about giants. Okay, but so giants are not as intelligent, but they're still on that spectrum of moral agency. But you get this thing happening with the bad guys in Harry Potter, where they denigrate those classes. Of course, they also denigrate certain classes, even within the wizarding world, like those of mixed blood, that they're not pure blood wizards. You have this clear parallel to the Nazis trying to differentiate who counts as pure blood and who doesn't count as pure blood, and coming up with tests and criteria and all of that. And of course, the good guys in Harry Potter, Harry, the Weasleys, all of their friends, the Order of the Phoenix, push against that. To greater or lesser extent, right? People make fun of Hermione for championing the House Elves' cause. I think, you get Sirius, who has this really dismissive attitude towards his house elf. But for the most part, there's this push, at least much more prevalently on that side, to protect the interests of these classes of agents, to treat them equally, to have compassion on them, etc. Even within Hogwarts, though, think about the people, the students in Hogwarts who are bullied, who are outcasts. Those are the people who Harry and his friends befriend. Think about Luna Lovegood, who people make fun of. They hide her stuff. They prank her. Think about Neville Longbottom. People, even within, like the class of the characters you're supposed to like, kind of treat Neville badly. Harry and his friends don't. So there's this sense that what's being promoted, it's not that Harry Potter is a didactic sort of novel or series of novels, but it's clear that that's the good way to be. That's the way that that you ought to be as presented in the series. So I won't belabor that anymore, but you do get the same inversion of values. The outcast should be brought in, the trod upon should be elevated. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Okay, so second theme, and this will be my last point, but it might be the deepest and most obscure point too. I think it could possibly be the most central theme, at least of the last book or two, maybe if those could be seen as the culmination of the series, maybe of the whole series. And that is the attitude, the proper attitude towards life and death. What you see is that the Death Eaters are trying to overcome or defeat death. Voldemort himself is trying to defeat death in the most serious way possible, which is he wants to not die. This is why he creates the Horcruxes. He wants to not die. Okay, and of course the Death Eaters are called the Death Eaters for that very reason. They're trying to overcome death. Now, does that mean that if we're to juxtapose that with the good guys, that the good guys don't care, are not supposed to care about dying? No, I don't think so. And this is where it gets kind of subtle. If you remember in the 7th book, when Harry and Hermione go to the Godric's Hollow, they go to a seminary, they actually see 2 different tombstones or gravestones that have Bible verses on them. And one is, for where your treasure is, there your heart shall be also. I believe that's from the Gospel of Matthew. And the other is 1 Corinthians 15:26. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. And Harry, I believe it's Harry, says something like, oh, that's weird. That sounds like a Death Eater thing. And Hermione says, no, I actually think it's importantly different. Here, it's not that we're trying to not die. It's that death will be defeated in some other way. We'll live past our own death. Death can be accepted, and yet death can still be defeated. So let me give a take on what's going on here. Death is an evil. And that's not being disputed here. That's not being rejected by Harry Potter, even in the end, or Dumbledore, or any of the central good figures. Life is a good, and that's not being disputed. But it might be that you can idolize a good. And what that could mean is overvaluing something that's good. So it's good, everyone should recognize it's good, but they shouldn't put its worth above what it is. Now, for something as good as life, it's hard to overvalue it, but it should still be possible. I mean, it is still possible. Your life is very valuable. It's hard to overvalue your life, but you still can overvalue your life. But maybe even more importantly, even if you value it correctly, there are appropriate and inappropriate ways to pursue any given good. So, this is part of what in philosophy has been called the natural law tradition, that sometimes you do wrong by pursuing a good in an inappropriate or incorrect way. So let's think about some other cases, like, really briefly, lying. What are you doing when you lie? Well, you might be pursuing your self-interest. Is that to say that lying is wrong because you're pursuing your self-interest? No. And it's not to say that your self-interest isn't a valuable thing, but lying is an inappropriate way of pursuing that good. And similarly, you might think the Death Eaters and Voldemort are avoiding death and pursuing life in inappropriate ways, whereas Harry is neither overvaluing life nor pursuing life and trying to avoid death in those inappropriate or incorrect ways. Okay, how does this connect up with the Christian tradition? Well, of course, Jesus tells his followers that you actually, he accepts the view that life is good, but he gives us this paradox. He says, those who seek their own lives will lose it, but those who give up their own lives for his sake will receive life. So it's not to claim that life isn't good. I mean, this is paradoxical, it's enigmatic, but he's certainly not claiming that life isn't good, that you should abandon it. What he's claiming is that this good should be pursued in certain ways and not in others. That you shouldn't overvalue your life. You shouldn't pursue your self-interest at the expense of all else, which is what Voldemort is doing. So there again, you get the idea that death will be defeated, but we cannot enshrine the value of our own life so much that we pursue it at all costs. That's what gets us into the mindset of Voldemort trying to save his own life at all costs, trying to avoid death. So death will be defeated, and it is. Harry, in one way, defeats death. He dies and comes back to life. But it's not to be defeated. It's not to be avoided in the way that Voldemort is trying to avoid it. Okay, so those are a couple of the themes that I see showing up in both narratives. I'd be interested to hear from y'all if you see any other big overlaps. But one thing I'll end with is this. I was born in '89, so I grew up in the sort of Harry Potter generation, the generation where we were hitting that age where it was really intriguing to us right when it was hitting at least the U.S. market, and at least in high levels of popularity. So I remember, I think it was 3rd or 4th grade that I became aware of Harry Potter. I think the first 2 were out at that point. And that's exactly when they were blowing up. And it's exactly when you know, you're kind of at the age to read those books. And then I was the generation that followed it through, and I think the 7th one came out when I was 18. At that time, there was obviously a ton of controversy about these books because it was claimed, especially amongst Christian circles, that they were satanic, that they were anti-Christian, they were promoting sort of satanic magic and all of this stuff. And it's very ironic, it turns out, that in fact these are books that exhibit deep Christian themes, and I think intentionally so. Rowling has said that she was influenced by Christian themes, and of course we have, like I've mentioned here, actual Bible verses referenced in the books. So it really should have been obvious to us, or to anybody paying attention or who wanted to read the books, that that these were books that had a deep Christian theme. All right, let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.